All right, everyone. Now, it's time for our second panel of today's conference. This panel is going to look at economics and policy impacts. To moderate this panel is our own executive committee member, Chris Sands. Chris is a true scholar of Canada-U.S. relations. In fact, many people think that Chris is actually Canadian, but the truth is he was born and raised in Detroit, Michigan. However, as a Fulbright scholar, he did complete his doctoral dissertation at the Norman Patterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University. And in 2019, he was named a senior fellow of Massey College at the University of Toronto. Chris Sand is a lecturer at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and directs the Hopkins Center for Canadian Studies. Chris is the director of the Canada Institute, which until recently was housed at the Wilson Center. His most recent book, co-edited with David Thomas, is Canada and the United States, Differences That Count, published in 2023. Chris is the founding member and officer of the Canadian Politics section of the American Political Science Association and is a member of the editorial board of the Canadian Foreign Policy Journal. Here to introduce his panel, Chris Sands.
Thanks very much, Steve. And I really appreciated Carleton letting me come up while I was working on my dissertation on a Fulbright grant, because I live in Washington and it's so busy. You have to get out of town to get anything done, which I think most congressmen agree with as well. Thank you very much, Steve, for the introduction. We have a very, very strong panel, and I don't want to take up any of their time, so I'm going to walk very brief introductions. To my left, Michael Gregory is Deputy Chief Economist with the Bank of Montreal. One step over, Stephen DeBoer is a recently retired Deputy Minister and Foreign Defense Policy Advisor to the Prime Minister and a former permanent representative to the World Trade Organization for Canada. And to the far left, only geographically, not politically, is Laura Dawson, who was one of my predecessors as Director of the Canada Institute at the Woodrow Wilson Center. She did a very good job because she kept it open for me to take over, as opposed to me, who let it fall apart. She is today the Executive Director of the Future Borders Coalition. So I'm going to start with Michael and turn things over to you.
We have a mic dysfunction. Oh, they all work? Oh.
This one is still on.
Okay, thank you, sorry. It's the lack of a light that kind of threw me. Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. All right, so we saw this morning, very early this morning, the next salvo in America's global trade war. China, as fully expected, reciprocated to the 125% tariffs that their goods now face in the United States, and they did the same thing, tit for tat. So U.S. exports to China now generate a 125% tariff, and you know, the average tariff rate now in the U.S. economy has just soared, literally. And I think one of the panelists and the former one mentioned it, is that we were just above 2% at the end of February. And depending on what you assume about carve-outs for various sectors, you're probably looking at something that is in around the 26, 27, 28% range. We haven't seen average tariff levels like that in 100 years. Last week, we wrote a piece called Make Smoot-Hawley Great Again. And I do think that is, you know, it's a concern. And only now are you beginning to see a narrative kind of develop on how disruptive tariffs are for economies. And usually when I make my presentations, I spend most of my time in the U.S., I go through the taxonomy of how this actually works. And I think it's kind of important. Like for Canada, it's pretty obvious. Near 20% of GDP is made up of exports to the U.S. So if somehow those are interrupted, the impact will be felt quite significantly. It's interesting because exports to Canada from the U.S. kind of measures in maybe sopping wet, standing on the scale at about 1.5% of GDP. And a lot of my nationalistic friends would sort of get in some rant and go, they need us as much as we need them. And I'll say, actually, we need them about 10 times more than they need us. So that is the reality. But that's in general. We all know in specific industries and specific commodities that Canada has a much more influence than that. So here we are with this global trade war, and ultimately it's an impact on Canadian exports. There's retaliatory tariffs for Canada, so that's an impact on Canadian inflation, and it's really that double whammy hit to export growth, higher prices that really undermines this domestic economy. In the U.S., it's more or less the inflation side that really gets the huge impact on the economy. Because ultimately, U.S. importers pay the tariffs. Sometimes I say that and people go, what? Yeah, U.S. importers pay the tariffs, not foreigners. And how they choose then to distribute that between passing it on to consumers, or maybe taking it in their own margins as the importer, or maybe trying to get their the foreign exporter to take it on their margin. It depends. You know, when tariffs started going up on China, the first thing Walmart did was ask its suppliers if they would take a bit of the impact of that on their margins. And so not sure exactly how that ended up. So, you know, in the last while, we have made some major changes to our economic forecast. And unfortunately, this is probably the hardest environment I can ever remember kind of making a forecast. It's not because we don't know what's happening. I mean, this reminds me a lot of the initial period of the COVID pandemic, or maybe the global financial crisis. You're kind of not sure exactly what's going to happen. You kind of have a sense of the direction. But policy is moving like a ping pong ball here. So it makes it extremely difficult to project. And sadly, I have to do that as part of my job and advise our risk managers and our credit lenders and things like that. So we have, since about the beginning of March, we have made some changes to our forecast. And, you know, for Canada, we have literally taken on a fourth over fourth basis, which is the way to kind of measure how much growth is actually taking place. We've gone from about 1.6% growth, which is where we were before tariffs really began to be a problem, to a minus 0.7% now. Yes, we are officially forecasting a recession for the Canadian economy. Again, it's that double impact, exports and inflation. And it's also going to affect the U.S. economy as well. Obviously, it's not only trade with Canada, but it's trade with everybody. And now with 125, it's not even 125. When you add in the 20% fentanyl tariffs, you're looking at 145 on China. And when you add in on top of that, the tariffs from Trump 1.0 that survived the Biden administration, you're looking at pretty hefty tariffs on China. And they've increased in one fell swoop here. And before we can adjust the global supply chains yet again, that's going to have an impact on inflation in the U.S., which is ultimately how you erode the economic performance. And we have growth that went from 2%, which is solid growth, to about 0.6. No recession, but very muddling growth. And in that kind of environment, we have inflation going up from 2.5% up to 4% for the core PCE index. For some of you that know that is, you know, the underlying operating target that the Fed has, and they're shooting for 2. And we think by the end of this year we'll be at 4. That presents a huge problem for the Fed and all central banks, because inherently trade wars, which no one wins, are inherently stagflationary. They cause a dampening of growth and a boosting of inflation. And as a central bank, you know, it's hard to know which one you react to, because weaker growth says you should ease policy, and the inflation says maybe you should, you know, not ease policy as much. So again, this is what we're confronting right now, and we'll see how this unfolds. But we're kind of hoping that you know, things will settle down at least for a little while. Not sure how the relationship with China will go, but this is a huge impact for the global economy. And yes, maybe we'll see things going through Vietnam and Cambodia a little bit more, but the administration's on top of that one. So it's hard to see how we're going to get out of this one without a material disruption in the U.S. economy. And I'll leave it at that for now.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Michael. Stephen.
Well, thank you very much. Look, some of the things I'm going to talk about this morning, I presaged last evening, but look, this has been the most productive, collaborative, mutually beneficial relationship in the world between Canada and the United States. And there's been some chatter this morning and actually last night as well about the fact that maybe Trump has taken it down a notch, and why is that, and is it because of the election? But I would also say, even if he's not talking about the 51st state, President Trump has shown an enormous amount of animosity, and an unusual level of animosity towards Canada, challenges Canadian sovereignty for sure, but also our reliability as a partner. He definitely sees the relationship with Canada as one-sided, in which the United States is subsidizing Canada at the expense of the United States, using our trade surplus in goods, mind you, as proof. But he also randomly generates numbers. 200 billion seems to be a number that's floating around in his head. God knows where that number comes from. 64 billion of a trade surplus, I understand. 200 billion, I don't. So I'd really like to, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time because I'd really like to get into the discussion, but I thought it'd be useful just to set out the state of play right now. So on February 1st, the U.S. issued an executive order imposing 25% tariffs on all Canadian goods, 10% on energy products, citing poor border security, Canada as a source of illegal drugs and migrants, and insufficient law enforcement cooperation with the U.S. All of this contrary to any evidence. These tariffs were to go into effect on February the 3rd, and Canada successfully negotiated a pause on the imposition of tariffs until March the 4th. And when these measures did come into force on March the 4th, Canada responded with a $30 billion strike list and launched a 20-day consultation on an additional list of goods worth $200 billion. Then on March 6th, the U.S. announced an exemption to the tariffs on Canadian goods imported under CUSMA, or so-called CUSMA-compliant goods, which is a new term for all of us. And potash tariffs were adjusted down from 25% to 10%. And in a show of goodwill, Canada extended its consultation period on the $200 billion list until April 2nd. But to be very clear, and there were some in the U.S. administration who did not seem to understand this, the 25% tariffs on the $30 billion worth of U.S. goods remained. Then on February 10th, President Trump signed 2 proclamations announcing 25% tariffs on all foreign imports of steel and aluminum, and these tariffs were to be stacked on the earlier tariffs. So in response, Canada imposed a 25% tariff on U.S. goods on a package of $29.8 billion. So now we're at $60 billion. Then on April the 3rd, the U.S. imposed a 25% tariff on any vehicle not assembled in the U.S., with plans to place tariffs on auto parts by May 3rd. God knows how they're going to do that. Canada responded with its own 25% auto tariffs on $27.7 billion on vehicles that were not CUSMA compliant, but deliberately carved out CUSMA compliant auto parts and also put in place a duty remission process. Canada and Mexico were spared the global tariffs that were imposed on Liberation Day last week, and were not impacted, and thus are not impacted by the 90-day tariff suspension announced yesterday. This is, I feel like that show on Soap, where it's like, are you confused? Well, you won't be. This is incredibly confusing and it's very difficult to imagine reactions. Just one thing on the tariff response. I think from an economics perspective, I think a lot people would argue there's no point in retaliation. The tariffs will do their damage in the U.S. All on their own, and they speak for themselves in terms of the folly of these tariffs. I think the problem for a country like Canada is the political imperative to respond in some way. So I think it's very important to distinguish between the policy and political response and the economic response and what is driving some of these things. So now Canada is living with U.S. tariffs and facing the prospect of future tariffs. Canada's tariff response means that as of today, $90 billion in trade is subject to tariffs, or about 24% of our total trade. In contrast, the U.S. has covered about 41% of its trade with Canada in tariffs, with estimated trade subject to tariffs of approximately $233 billion. This speaks to the imbalance in the relative size of Canada and the United States, and also speaks to the ability or inability of Canada to respond as effectively as it might to U.S. tariffs. Essentially what I'm arguing here is that Canada is very quickly running out of retaliation runway, quite frankly. I was really gratified to hear the mayor of Cleveland this morning. He gets it. He's calling these tariffs a national sales tax. He's spot on. He completely understands what is happening. I think policymakers in Canada are really struggling to try to make sense of what Trump is trying to do. There are so many contradictions, too many seemingly irrational decisions, too much zigzagging in the policy choices that are made and then unmade. Too many contradictions within the Trump administration and what they say amongst the decision makers and between them and President Trump himself. We're probably not doing ourselves any favors by trying to ascribe some logic to what is happening. We might be burning up too much of our intellectual capacity doing that. But I would say it does make deal making and the way forward incredibly difficult. The future is not clear. I mentioned this yesterday, but the other big problem is, sure, you can sit down and try to negotiate an agreement with President Trump. He has demonstrated that these are not necessarily valuable, and we're not sure how enduring they would be. And I would say from a political perspective, it will be very difficult to come back as a politician and triumphantly announce that you have a deal with the Trump administration and now there's going to be trade peace. I think there will be a great deal of skepticism within Canada. But the relationship is too important for us not to be talking, for us not to be trying to manage this relationship. I think the other thing that we need to be thinking about and thinking about hard are both the consequences that has been set out very well by Michael, the consequences of what is happening, but then the unintended consequences of what is going on. And I'm hoping that we can have more of a discussion of that in the following our presentations. Certainly this idea of trade diversification, closer relations with the EU. I openly question whether Canada can afford to have two trade wars going on at the same time, one against China and one against the United States. And then we also need to be thinking about, and it's an organization near and dear to my heart, what is the future of the World Trade Organization? Where does that end up? How does the United States fit within that? We're also already seeing in the Asia context, just getting back to China for one moment, like the treatment of China and how other countries in the region are interacting with China. You see this at the WTO as well, where China ends up becoming, ironically, I think from the American perspective, the defender of the multilateral trading system and the defender of free trade. And what that means for other trading partners in the world, I think it will be fascinating to follow, and what that means for Canada as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Didn't want to step on your applause. Thank you very much, Stephen. Laura, over to you.
Great, thank you. Good morning, and thank you for the kind introduction, Chris. That was very nice. It's great to be in Cleveland with so many friends and old friends. I haven't been to a CUSLI for a while, but it is near and dear to my heart. And if you'll indulge me, I'm going to start with the Jim Peterson story. I was almost going to stand up and say this last night, but I didn't. So I was involved very much so with CUSLI about 10 years ago when Jim Blanchard and Jim Peterson and David Jacobson and a few others thought it'd be a good idea to start the Council for the Great Lakes region, that we ought to have the Great Lakes states and provinces get together and be able to provide a unified voice on a number of issues. And so I was involved in that as the matchmaker, and for a while I was also the founding director. So I spent a lot of time with Jim Peterson, and he was a wonderful, wonderful guy. And one time we're sitting in a car or on a plane or in an airport, and he says, "Did I ever tell you about the time I helped Mikhail Baryshnikov defect?" And I said, no, I did not, Jim. And he goes on to explain that in 1974, he was contacted because of his relationships with both the government of Canada and the arts community to help this aspiring, brilliant Russian dancer defect from the Kirov Ballet. And he said, of course, sure. And he was literally in a getaway car behind what used to be called the O'Keefe Center in Toronto. I think it's called the Hummingbird Center now. He was the getaway car. And Baryshnikov was supposed to leave at the intermission, but he wanted to stay and dance the whole thing. So Jim's outside cooling his jets. Finally, Baryshnikov jumps in the car. The KGB is literally looking for him, or his minders, they were KGB. And off they go to Jim's farm in Mono, in north of Toronto. And they thought that it was going to be a relatively easy transition. It would just be, hi, how you doing, a handoff. Jim had a few sandwiches and a few beers that Heather had put in the fridge for them. And so he called Ottawa and said, okay, I think this was Trudeau Sr., are you ready with the documentation for Mr. Baryshnikov? He's ready to jump into the West. And they said, oh, sorry, that's going to take a while. But we're sending up an RCMP security detail for you because, we know there's guys looking for you. So the RCMP arrives, 2 or 3 of them, and Jim says, and so I called Heather, we got more beer and sandwiches, and spent a delightful week. Anyway, so I apologize for the digression, but it was just such a wonderful Jim Peterson story and really captures the essence of what a gentleman and really a mensch he was. As for me, I am a journeywoman in the world of Canada-U.S. relations. I don't really know what my official title should be. Right now, I'm the executive director of the Future Borders Coalition. We will be changing our name this summer to the North American Trade and Travel Coalition. But for the last 25 years, I have tried to advance U.S.-Canada economic relations through public education, through research, through dialogue, through a promotion of cooperation where possible, and civil disagreement where not possible. So lately I have been very, very, very busy. I counted this month I will have slept in my own house 10 days out of the month. My husband, not impressed. I am a Canadian. I am a U.S. green card holder. I live in Atlanta, Georgia, but mostly I live in the departure lounge at Pearson Airport. And mostly I am talking to businesses in the U.S. and Canada and government officials trying to figure out, we can't even possibly know what comes next, but to try to assess the risks, real risks from made-up risks, things that are being amplified unnecessarily, in my opinion, and what businesses should be doing to move forward in this period of extreme uncertainty. Having a tariff war is one thing. Having it amplified by existential threats against Canada, at least that's how it's perceived in Canada, adds a significant degree of difficulty on top of that. And so, spending a lot of time with Canadians trying to parse through this. And it's extremely difficult. I do a lot of work on border security. When the government of Canada announced $1 billion US, 1.3 billion in new border spending, I worked a little bit with public safety, Canada's Department of Public Safety. I said, okay, that looks very good. And then I quietly went over to the U.S. Department of Homeland Security and said, hey, this is what the Canadians are thinking. Does this kind of look like what you'd be looking for? And they said, yeah, got it, need it. And so our organization was able to help knit that proposal together crosswalk it in a fairly productive way. And while I was working with the Minister of Public Safety, David McGuinty, he said, this is really, really upsetting, but my mother told me that you can't be angry and smart at the same time. And I think that is something that really, I'm advising counseling in Canada, is the need for patience and grace. It's not that the messages are not landing in the United States. Every business I talk to, I was in Texas last week with Dan. Hey, Dan, we were in Texas last week. Every business I speak to almost always begins with, we're really sorry about what's happening with this 51st state stuff. We don't agree with it. But there's not much that we can do at this moment because we're scared for our business. If I'm a politician, I'm scared about being primaried. I just don't know what the next steps should be. But rest assured that we're hearing you. We just don't know how to act and how to react on this. So I am optimistic for better times ahead. At least some clarity. I am concerned that politicians and journalists, not the ones who are here today, but politicians and journalists love to take uncertainty and fear and churn it into something much more toxic. And I am also concerned that the message that Canada would like to send to the United States, what Canadians would like Americans to know, has not landed because, and I'm sorry to any Canadian government officials who are listening, or because Canada did not tell the story well enough in advance. A year and a half ago, I spoke to the Prime Minister's cabinet retreat, said you've got to be in the U.S. cities and towns. You've got to have the messages to legislators, Republicans and Democrats. And this didn't happen. There was outreach, and it was good in some respects, but it wasn't the kind of local level grassroots stuff that needed to happen in order to counter the misinformation. And most Americans are still surprised that Canada is their largest trading partner, and still surprised at the level of damage that a trade war can cause. I'm also concerned that we as Canadians, I'm going to still wear that hat, have been so caught up in the fever of righteous indignation that we have forgotten, as Stephen said yesterday, that geography is destiny. If you are running an integrated manufacturing company in Sarnia, you can't just say, oh, not going to trade with the U.S. anymore. I get it. They've insulted me. You have to figure out a way to make that work. Moreover, in our border communities, it's really, really difficult when you're already faced with so much uncertainty, when you are now paying a 25% surtax on your groceries when you come back across the border. And when you complain about this, you get it, well, I get it, Windsor, Detroit, but that's kind of a you problem. That's not an Ottawa problem. That's not a Washington problem. That's kind of a you thing. So we hope you'll figure it out. Meanwhile, we have travel boycotts. I just heard from some bridges this morning. Last month, there was a 30% reduction in passenger traffic, 25 to 30%. This month, we're looking for 30 to 50%. I get it. People want to send a message. People want to spend their money where they think it's going to be valued, but if you're in one of these border communities, if your livelihood depends on cross-border tourism, you're over a barrel. It's tough already, and it's getting tougher. So again, back to David McGuinty, you can be angry or smart. I choose smart. And I choose to be a Pollyanna and look for areas of potential cooperation, ways to ride through this uncertainty, ways to stay inside the tent. Americans are worried about the role of China in the global economy. They're worried about fentanyl in their kids' school. They're worried about a migration system that is entirely broken. And so if Canada can help with that and demonstrate that they're a partner in that, I think it's a much more tenable situation than just pushing back and saying, no, that's, again, a you problem. That's not an us problem. Happy to chat about this further, but thanks for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Laura. And this has been an interesting conference already because we've had a lot of almost familial metaphors for the relationship, whether it's, as Peter McKay was saying, a break or a breakup, or are we in a divorce or trial separation? What kind of relationship do we have? I always liked, some of you will remember this old song from 3 Degrees. When will I see you again? Is this true love, or are we just friends? Is this the beginning, or is this the end? So with the musical advice, I want to ask all of you, how do you see this relationship going forward from here? Is there an alternative for Canada, maybe a configuration including the EU, stronger partnership with Mexico? How does Canada move forward, and how does the US need to move forward to keep some semblance of this relationship intact? I don't know if that's an appropriate question for you, Michael, but let me start with Michael. We'll go in the same order.
Well, I mean, obviously, we're coming up to the point now where the USMCA or CUSMA, I spend most of my time in the US, I still call it the USMCA, is up for renegotiation. That's for next year, but it's going to happen this year. It's going to happen pretty soon after the election, I suspect. And I guess like the question that was kind of raised earlier was that what can we do in there, like can we sort of defang? I think that was the expression, was some of the powers that seem to be behind the tariffs that Canada's facing. And I just mentioned that because I do think in CUSMA, USMCA, we did attempt on doing something like that. As it was made clear earlier, is that Canada's auto industry has been in secular decline. I think Canada produces 12-13% of the vehicles for all of North America. That's come down quite sharply. It's lost market share to the U.S. South and to Mexico. And in fact, it's a secular decline across the board. And in the original CUSMA USMCA, there was a side agreement that said that as long as Canada commits to not increasing its production both in quantity and dollar terms beyond certain levels, in the event there are 232 tariffs on the auto sector, which were threatened in the Trump 1.0, they wouldn't be applied to Canada. That's a signed contract with the United States, the first Trump administration, and yet that hasn't held water. So I don't know what you can do now with something where even if you have an agreement that it doesn't hold water. So I do think we still have to, geography is destiny, which we've heard many times already, and so we still have to work, but it's going to be a working relationship. Friends definitely without benefits. I think that's the probably way to think about it. And I do think, we are looking at the other alternatives. There's no coincidence, I'll wrap up very quickly, that in the first 2 years of the Trump administration, several other ventures that Canada was doing all came to fruition in terms of the Canada Free Trade Agreement, like trading within Canada, the CETA, the trade agreement with Europe, and then the comprehensive and Trans-Pacific Partnership, whatever the new name of that one is. But they all sort of came to there, and I don't think we fully sort of use that. But now I do think that there's an effort to see what can we go along these channels, particularly on domestic trade, which there seems to be a lot of momentum on that front. And to a lot of my nationalistic friends, I always say, at the end of the day, Canada's going to be different. The Canada-U.S. relationship is going to be different. And maybe we're actually a slightly better Canada because of it. We'll have to see. I'll do that. Yeah.
Stephen, let me turn it to you and maybe tease out Canada-China, because that's an interesting dimension of the relationship. Then you mentioned it in your opening remarks.
So it's been said a couple of times. Laura just said it as well. Michael has said this. We are going to have to talk to the Americans. There's no, it is a necessity. This is a relationship that requires us to sit down and have a conversation. I think the tragedy is that we've gone back 80 years, quite frankly. And this might be, it might start off with a friends without benefits relationship. It's going to take a long time, and there's a very good case to be made for closer economic integration with the United States. There's a really strong case to be made for complete free trade between Canada and the United States. I mentioned this last night as well, but I mean, if you looked at the NAFTA, there were some logical next steps sort of built into the NAFTA. So for example, a customs union sort of was the logical next thing to happen. All of that has been reversed, but that doesn't mean that we don't sit down with the United States. We're going to have to sit down with the United States and try to manage this. I do think you're right, CUSMA review is going to come up soon. I think the Americans will be surprised that Canada has issues with them as well. It's not as if the United States is a completely unvarnished, beautiful free trader. I mean, there are consistent problems with the United States at the federal and at the state level. I'm thinking of procurement, I'm thinking about the Jones Act, I'm thinking about the way their own dairy industry is organized, for example. They have consistently hidden behind states and state powers at a time when they pushed us to move on our provinces. There are things that we will want. Labor practices in the United States, particularly right-to-work states, will continue to be a problem for Canada. I think the United States will continue to be surprised that we raise these issues. But there are things that we would like to see addressed as well. In the short term, we've got to get these tariffs off. We have to get back to free trade. The folly of what's happening is, I think at the outset, I think it was quite clear to policymakers in Canada, there wasn't necessarily a problem with Make America Great Again. There was a sense that Canada could actually help in making America great again. We could, working with Mexico, take on China collectively. We could be doing things together that would be beneficial to the United States and obviously beneficial to Canada as well. That's gone. But this notion of trying to fight two trade wars at this point is, I don't think is necessarily sustainable. And we may need to start thinking about how we go about doing that. But somebody mentioned this morning retaliation at the business level. And the threat of retaliation, or the threat of annoying or angering Trump, is a real one as well. What if Canada dropped all of our tariffs to China tomorrow? What if Chinese goods started to come into Canada in ways that we haven't seen before? What would Trump say about that, and how would he react? This is something that Canadian policymakers need to keep in the back of their minds. One other thing I would say, I think I know The Economist did an article on this. It was half in jest and half not, about Canada joining the EU. But I would say, from a policy perspective, there is interest, not necessarily in Canada joining the EU, but making it a closer union than we have now under CETA. CETA is seen on both sides as a big success. What else can be done that brings us closer to the EU? I think there's a big appetite for that at the political level, but I think also within the population in Canada. People tend to look very favorably on the EU. One final thing I would say. At this point, I do not think that the anti-American rhetoric in Canada is directed at Americans per se. I think it's mostly directed at the Trump administration, and more particularly to Donald Trump. But I am fearful that that will become a problem going forward. There is a really big benefit for Canadians going to Florida in the winter, going to New York and taking trips. There's a really good benefit for us having familiar and friend relationships across the border. This is what we should be doing. This is what we should be honoring. This is what we should be celebrating. When we start breaking those ties, that becomes a problem. And so it's not a happy consequence. I'm not necessarily happy to see the 23% less traffic to the United States. I understand it, and I'm fearful where that might lead. So we need to start talking fast.
Yeah. So back in the olden days, I used to be a professor of international trade on the political science side, so I can't do the math or the law. But I was often teaching about the origins of the WTO system and why it was important. And yes, the U.S. was in the lead, and they got to make the rules, but the rules also benefited Canada, so we should follow along. And the first two articles, I'm sorry, I'm lecturing on WTO to the former Canadian permanent representative. First two articles are the MFN tariff, most favored nation tariff, so that what you give to one, you give to everyone, and the other one is the bound tariff. So once you set agreed upon tariff rate with your nearest and dearest, that rate you agree not to put that up again. So with these reciprocal tariffs and the other disruption, we've basically lost or had a substitution for that. So if you're a business, if you couldn't make the USMCA or CUSMA compliance, if you couldn't do all the paperwork for the rules of origin in order to identify whether or not you had a USMCA originating product, they say, okay, never mind, I'll take the MFN tariff, which may be 2 or 3%. It's easier than doing all this paperwork. Now, we don't have that option within North American trade because of the new tariffs that are substituting for those. And so if this continues, we're really looking at the demise of the rules-based trading system, the multilateral rules-based system. Or we're looking at a situation where you've got a fortress North America in which those rules of origin and tariff and who's in and who's out apply, and things are very expensive and relatively limited, but you're not importing much, but neither are you exporting much. And then you have a rest of world. And what happens with rest of world, with those billions of consumers that live out there somewhere? Are we in a state of anarchy where we don't have rules anymore? Or is there some sort of restoration of the WTO system? It's kind of an open question. And if there's going to be that kind of restoration, then who's going to be the leader this time? If it was the US last time, who leads the charge for that kind of multilateral open trade? Is it going to be the EU? I think it's probably likely to be, that leadership is to be found somewhere among the G7, among US and Canada peer countries, but it's not clear that that could be the EU. If Canada has a closer relationship with the EU, I think that's a great idea in terms of rules and leadership, but that's not where Canada's markets are. Canada's markets are in developing countries that want the stuff that Canada produces. The EU, we can swap our wine and we can swap our sophisticated optical equipment with them, but that's not a really great economic rationale for trade. So we have one set of new partners for markets and one set of new partners for rules. And then if we do have that rest of world getting together and agreeing to shore up the rules-based trading system, that's great to say in practice. But if the White House comes to you and say, we're going to give you a special deal, come on over here inside the tent, it's pretty easy to defect from that external WTO type regime into a North America or White House directed regime. So I don't know what we do, but here's two things I know. I know that the US has some really interesting strategies about how to reduce the role of China in the world. I read executive orders, and some of them make sense to me. Not all of them, some of them do make sense to me. But at the level of tactics, has not worked particularly well. I know that Canada has some of the best trade negotiators in the world, best officials thinking through these things at a very granular level, but not always thinking through, well, what does 5 years look like? What does 10 years look like? Because that's not the job of a very busy trade negotiator. So Canada's got tactics without strategy. Seems to me you should be able to put these two things together and have a robust plan for moving forward and how to execute it in the short term. But that maybe is wishful thinking on my part.
Thank you very much, Laura. And I'm going to come to audience questions in a minute. So if you're thinking about one, we have microphones there so that you can jump up and ask. In keeping with the spirit of CUSLI karaoke that I've introduced, I feel like someplace between Helen Reddy's "You and Me Against the World" to the Guess Who's "American Woman Stay Away from Me," all at the same time here in this panel. But from the point of view of a lot of the legal community and the businesses in this world, what can we do while we're sorting out the bilateral relationship that can be risk mitigation, that can be practical for business going forward? What kind of strategies might you suggest? Are there some openings that you see, say business to business or citizen to citizen? And this time I'm going to go to Laura and work my way this way.
I just keep talking and talking and talking. Yes, business to business and citizen to citizen is the most important area that we can be working on. Our businesses are incredibly integrated, and they just don't know how to manage things moving forward. They need some guidance from our leaders to say, hey, here's what's going to happen next, and here's how you can help to shore up this relationship. It needs to be, the message needs to be coming out of business leaders in U.S. cities about how important this relationship is. It's great when you send a minister abroad, but it's so much better when you've got someone like Bombardier in Kansas, which has a really strong footprint in private jet manufacturing, to say, look how much we invest, look how much we're doing. So yes, business to business and person to person. Personally, as someone who runs a travel and trade organization, I hate travel boycotts. My mother, on the other hand, she loves them, but I hate them. So please do go to the United States and do share all of the important ways that Canada and the U.S. work together with any American you see. And finally, we just need to tone down the rhetoric. Social media is not our friend. It's amplifying the worst messaging. So we need to tone down the rhetoric and really focus on areas of connection and common ground.
So, Stephen.
Do you mean Canadian rhetoric?
I mean both. I mean the Facebook post that Alex Panetta was mentioning that have two things
right.
and eight false things. But I also note that when I look at the Canadian newspapers every morning, which I do, the first 15 stories are, this is awful, this is terrible, Canadian woman detained. Let's go off the metric system. I mean, the first 3 are usually worth reading, but the next 7 or 8 are just feeding off this kind of uncertainty and anger.
Okay, well, the metric system was a new one for me.
Globe and Mail, last week.
Okay. I think the answer, and I don't say this as a abdication of responsibility, and Ambassador Blanchard said this at the beginning of this morning, the answer has to be within the United States itself. We need American business, and we need American politicians, we need the American people to be talking. It's the famous euphemism, but I mean, U.S. politics is about Americans. Americans are the voters. These are the people that can move the discussion. There's absolutely a role for Canadian policymakers, for Canadian business to help make that story, but the story has to happen here. I think one of the challenges that we have in Canada, and it's one of the reasons I asked the question of, we're very obsessed about what's happening. This is a classic Canadian story where we're really fussing about something that most Americans aren't even thinking about. But there is something about Trump that is so absolutely strange and horrifying that it's hard. It's sort of like looking at a car crash. Like, you can't help but avert your eyes. And I think the Canadian media is falling prey to this. But honestly, like, I personally, like, I see a news story, like when Trump wanted to turn Gaza into some sort of tourist paradise. I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, this can't be true. This can't be right. It's really difficult not to sort of get sucked into this. We shouldn't, I agree, but it's hard not to. I think, and this will be a challenge for Canadian leaders, absolutely, going forward, but the answer has to be here in the United States. I would also say, and this is a challenge to the Americans as well, Canadians we're sitting in Canada going, how did this happen? How did you vote for this person? What is with your political system? And why aren't there protests in 100 cities in the United States? How is this happening? Where is Congress? What is, like, we're asking some pretty profound questions about this country, and I would really encourage this, like, the United States needs to step up and start explaining and trying to get this back on track.
Amen.
Michael?
I'll keep it short. I had an interesting conversation just a couple days ago with my daughter, who wanted to take a summer vacation with her boyfriend, and wanted to go to Hawaii, and was very concerned about the sort of implied little boycott that's going on. You know, people aren't traveling as much to the U.S. and I sort of was thinking a little bit about this too. Is that and even perhaps a little bit of a boycott that goes on for U.S. distributors in Canada that hire Canadian workers. You know, that this thing can get a little too far, and I do think that it's important that we keep the relationship open. You know, maybe we feel better, or the country feels better because they're taking these measures. But I'm not sure it helps at the end of the day. Even you know, countervailing tariffs that Canada puts on. You know, I'm not sure that, you know, we get hurt by that. You know, and I'm not sure it actually hurts who we're trying to hurt. Canadians definitely get hurt. And we can't win this, and no one wants to say we can't win a trade war, but we can't. So I do think it's I think we need a little bit of a rethink here, that it's okay to buy, you know, Washington State wine. I would love to see more BC wine in the Ontario liquor stores, because BC has the same quality of wine as Washington State. But I'm more likely to get that than the BC stuff. So there are things we can do, and in terms of advising businesses, is this to push for that, pursue that. This is an opportunity here to increase internal trade, and maybe to increase trade sort of outside the U.S. for now. But I do think at the end of the day, it matters what happens, and I'm not really for these boycotts, because they hurt ordinary Americans, and it's not ordinary Americans that are kind of doing this directly, and so I think we have to take a little bit of a breather.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Now we turn to you, the audience, for your questions. And I see, do I have one? Oh. I see people moving to the mic. Over to you.
One question and one comment. To Stephen's point about popular opposition to the tariffs, I will say that I believe on last Saturday, there was over 1,000 protests in cities across the United States to Trump's policies, and at least in Lansing at the Michigan Capitol, there were many Canadian flags and placards about tariffs and our friends in Canada. I guess I know the conference is on the World Trading Order, but I wonder if I could zoom out a tiny bit about a rules-based order, and I think those are intertwined. And so when we have an illogical approach to trade, this leads into an illogical approach to a rules-based order in the sort of domestic but also multilateral agreements that we have in the United States and with our partners. And so I'm wondering about a Canadian response to political instability, growing political instability in the United States. For example, tensions between the executive branch and the judiciary, discussions about a third term, and what a Canadian response might be to that. Is there a red line for Canada about growing oligarchy or authoritarianism in the United States?
Well, that's big. Can I take a little bit of a bite of that?
Absolutely.
I'm not going to go anywhere near most of that, but here's the thing. Having worked for both the U.S. and Canadian government, I think I'm the only person I know. I'm the only person I know who's done that. If you know somebody else, let me know. In diplomacy, you do not comment on the political actions of another sovereign state. That's their responsibility. That's their thing, and you live with wherever they are. Secondly, though, I want to distinguish that this is This is not a partisan issue. This is not hooray Democrats and boo Republicans or boo MAGA. In the United States, I think it is very possible to hold what maybe some folks in Ottawa think are contradictory opinions. That number one, we support free trade with Canada, and number two, we support Donald Trump as our president, and we're willing to give him some rope in order to do the things he says he's going to do because we are concerned about the prevalence of China and the trading system and others who don't follow the rules.
Anyone else want to jump in on that?
I would just say, and this is not a Canada-US issue necessarily, but I am concerned. I think we have not fully appreciated the leadership role that the United States had with respect to rule of law and promotion of democracy in the world. And I think the United States is very quickly losing their leadership role and the other countries' ability to model that behavior in ways that are great for the rule of law or for democracy. So it's not a positive development, I think, for the world to see some of these things happen. The Supreme Court has become incredibly politicized in ways that are not useful for a judiciary, I would say. What's happening with respect to democracy is not useful as an example for the rest of the world. So I think that is a concern. That we're learning very quickly what an oversized role the United States had in the world. When we think about the cutting of the $50 billion in aid and what that means, nobody can replace that $50 billion. It's not like other countries can rush in and say, "Oh, don't worry about it. We'll fix it." It doesn't necessarily work that way. The work that the CDC is doing in Africa is not replaceable. So these are big problems going forward. They're outside of the Canada-US context, but I think people should be thinking about that.
Mm-hmm. Michael, did you want to add? No. All right, we have another question, and I know we're getting close to time, but I can see that lunch is only slowly being set up, so we'll eat a little bit into that break. Over to you.
Thank you, Chris. I'm Barry Rape from the University of Michigan. Thank you for your thoughtful comments. We've been talking a lot about executive action in the United States in the form of tariffs, understandably so. But there are also really profound changes underway through lots and lots of executive orders that have nothing to do with Congress to change the basic functioning of the American economy, or at least promise to. And here I'm talking about environmental protections, climate protections, not just climate change issues, but fundamental shifts and changes in interpretations of clean air, clean water, toxic waste standards that have been in place for, in some cases, 30 or 40 years. And the express pitch, as you read these executive orders, 3 new ones have just come out this week, would give the president enormous power to strip states of authority, to bring back coal, to make other shifts and changes unilaterally. And the pitch is, you do this to reduce regulatory burden and juice up the economy, in some cases to offset any downsides of tariffs. My question is, if that continues to go forward, how does Canada respond? This is classic race to the bottom interpretation. And so in this case, does Canada align with the European Unions, the South Koreas, the Japans that are saying, no, we see a future for a more low carbon economy? Or does Canada deal with real incentives to match the US, not just tariff dollar for tariff dollar, but reducing regulatory burdens, especially in places across boundary, like the Great Lakes Basin, where all indications are the US is going to pull back on research and protections, even on things like biodiversity and sea lamprey, with the word biodiversity having caught the attention of the Trump administration because it's diversity. Thoughts about how Canada might respond to this? Thanks.
I think that's a Stephen question.
So that is a huge problem and a huge worry, particularly boundary waters, Great Lakes. I don't think there's more to come, we hear, on that, and that is enormously worrying. I don't think that, I'm guessing here, but I don't think the policy response is going to be to try to match or degrade the regulatory or environmental regime in Canada, because that would actually be hurting us in a very profound way. But when it comes to shared water, like the Great Lakes, that is enormously problematic. I would just say on the Great Lakes as well, it's not just the environmental aspects of this that worry the Canadian government. There's issues around shipping that going forward that could be hugely problematic. I think in that case, Canada will need to play a long game here and say we need to do whatever it is to sort of put a Band-Aid on this until things change or the United States comes to their senses. But this is almost an intensely local problem, not just a global problem. We share an airspace, we share boundary waters. So it's difficult to imagine that we would just follow the race to the bottom. It's also easy to imagine that we are going to suffer from the environmental degradation. So a lot of these problems require cooperation from your closest neighbors. So it is hugely problematic. I do not sense any movement politically within Canada to lower standards, environmental standards, for example. There is definitely a movement, it's more in the context of interprovincial trade barriers, to speed up environmental regulation to try to make the Federation work better. But that's about making the process work better, not about degrading the process or the underlying regulations. I can't offer any hope here except to say I think Canadians are very worried.
Anyone else want to jump in on this? I'll turn to Ambassador Blanchard.
I'm glad that we've heard from Michigan State University and the University of Michigan. We're glad they're here. This has been a wonderful panel, by the way. And yes, Laura, Mikhail Baryshnikov spoke at Jim Peters' funeral as well.
Wow.
Yeah.
And thanked him for the gift of freedom. It was really a wonderful short comment. I'm thinking, Stephen, what you mentioned, though, and I think this is a little leverage with the American political system. I think you may be right. If the United States defaults, then China will become the unlikely champion of free trade and multilateralism. And that's the last thing I think the political leaders in Washington would want. But what I wanted to say on top of that is that when I was at the Jim Peterson funeral, and there was a collection of largely liberal, but some conservative, and Peter MacKay was there and others, there was this huge gathering, and they said to me, Jim, how could the election even be close? We don't get it. What's going on here? Mm-hmm. And of course, I agree with them, and so did my wife, Janet. Obviously, we're staunch Democrats, but nevertheless, all my friends felt the same way everywhere, which is was remarkable, but that's the truth. So you mentioned it, today it may be Trump, but it's really the people of Canada looking at the voter in the United States and wondering what has changed. I happen to be, I think, the oldest person in this room. I'm blessed, part of a generation. We grew up with the architecture created by Roosevelt and Truman and Eisenhower and continued. The post-war structure of cooperation and national security, and it led to record prosperity. In my opinion, we've not only taken for granted our relationship with Canada, but those who are younger, not necessarily have taken for granted all this. We've taken for granted how blessed we've been with the system we have, both economic, military, cultural. We've taken it for granted. And as far as and so when I talk to young audience, I say, don't assume it's written in the stars that we're going to live well and be secure. Don't assume our democracy is going to be strong and survive its attacks and assaults. If we don't work at it, it's not going to be. We talk about American exceptionalism. Well, we have a chance to prove that now because it's failing right now. And that's what's going on in the United States. Democracy is on trial. It's not a good issue in a campaign. Cost of living is, crime is, or tariffs, a sales tax. But it's on trial, and it's in the United States. And so it's going to be all of my colleagues and the younger generations are going to have to prove that we'll make this work for our future. And I just love your commentary here, too, and your service. Thank you.
Does anyone? Anyone want to jump in with a final
I'll
comment
just
there?
Jump in quickly. I think that is so resonant, Ambassador Blanchard. I call him Ambassador Blanchard because I know him as the ambassador. You know him as the governor, man of all hats. But I think that is so resonant. People's fear that that they aren't living well, that things are worse for them and they are less secure. And that loss of hope, that uncertainty, which our media and social media feeds, is common across North America. It's not just, it's common in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario and Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan. I was at breakfast in Waco, Texas, and it felt like conversations I've had in Lethbridge, Alberta. People are feeling this everywhere, and they are searching for solutions. And unfortunately, there are no simple solutions for complex problems, but they are buying into the guy with the best slogan, whoever that may be.
Stephen?
I got nothing. I really want to hear the other question, if we still have time.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bruce Lowe for Taft, Stettinius and Hollister. Put on my other hat, British American Chamber of Commerce. Take that one off. Put on Greater Cleveland International Lawyers Group, another great Henry King brainchild. Since this is an economics and policy panel, and thank you for all your comments, which have been terrific, is there a possibility that Trump and Navarro, who predicts 50,000 points on the Dow in 3 years' time, are right and the rest of us are wrong? That's a question that everybody seems to be going one way. I just wonder if there's, are they completely crazy, or, is this a scenario that could work? I see a win-win situation in a bizarre sort of way. If Trump and Navarro are right, then we'll benefit. If they're wrong, then the win there is that the midterm elections will be a disaster for them, and this could be the shortest presidential term of a non-assassinated president ever. Thank you.
Wow. Michael?
The method in the madness, I guess, is probably a way to take a look at this. And I must admit, as I've done more reading and kept my mind open, you begin to see that there is some logic to all of this. The whole post-war World War II period that we've talked about, where the United States led the world in developing these institutions, the world's policeman, the world's lender of last resort. I mean, all of these things came at a price. Now, there are benefits and costs, but like with anything in economics, benefits tend to be very diffuse through economies. The costs tend to be very concentrated and visible and politically difficult sometimes. And I think as the global economy has just soared like gangbusters, we began to see these little clusters more and more begin sort of to pop up. So there's a whole notion of well, one of the reasons why we have a big trade deficit is because we have a big budget deficit. And part of the big budget deficit is because, we're the world's policemen. We have a huge military. Maybe if the rest of the world helped, shoulder that burden a bit in terms of compensating America, then that will help matters. So I do think there is some logic here that I think kind of works. Because there is pain. This adjustment has been pretty serious, and I think the President Trump latches on to those pockets of weakness. The other issue with respect, and having been on stage with Navarro before, he is a firebrand. There's no question about it. But it's all about China with him. All right, and everything gets pulled into that. And when you kind of look at the role that China's played in the global economy. And I think other speakers have mentioned it. It's not really Mexico or Canada. That's it's really that technology is one thing, but it's China, and they haven't played the way the rules of the game like they said they would when they entered the WTO. So I do think that if we're moving in a situation where somehow China is a little more isolated or is forced or we don't need them as much anymore. And then there's more realization of the very important role America's played in the past, you could see the thing kind of stabilizes a bit better. But again, I think there is a little bit of sound logic on the other side, which I think we have to give due deference to.
Stephen, Laura?
I agree that for everything that Trump says, there's a kernel of truth. There's something there. There's an itch that needs to be scratched. There's a problem that needs to be addressed. It's just, it then gets packaged in ways or blown up in ways that where you start to lose the logic of what is trying to go on. I think the problem with the Navarro goal is, even if it is correct, I don't think the time frame works. Because even if he was able to deliver on that, I don't think he can deliver on that before midterms or within 2 years or within 5 years. And so, and I also think that sure, that's one measure. And even if he is right, that might be the measure, but that can't be the only measure. The stock market doesn't vote. People in Kansas vote. And the question really will have to be, how are they faring? How are they doing? And again, there, I think you run out of runway. It's every 2 years in the United States where you have this election. I mean, one of the explanations I have for what happened in November is the price of eggs, of all things. But this is so what is the issue 2 years from now? I don't think it's the stock market index necessarily. I don't know what it is. It's not even 2 years anymore, but I don't know what it is. But I don't think you have the time frame to pull it off, even if you're right.
Yeah, just quickly, I mean, it's a fundamental problem of the way the global trade system was constituted. Nobody expected to have a China that was so large and could make just about everything in the world cheaper and more efficiently than you could. So how do you take this multilateral trading system and say, okay, the rules apply to everybody except China, because they're just too big. And so rethinking how to have a variable architecture for the international trade system, it's extremely difficult. I don't even know if it's possible. But to paraphrase, I think it was Dave Chappelle this week, he said, I just want to buy the Nikes. I don't want to have to make them.
Yeah.
Good point. Last question to you, sir.
My absolutely unscientific insight is that isolationism, protectionism, and anti-immigrationism have been bubbling below the surface of the American electorate for most of my life. Our politicians have tried to paper it over with different issues. This is from both parties, or pretend it wasn't that strong, and pretend that enlightened people knew better. And this, I submit, accounts for the blue-collar defection from the Democrats to the Trump Republican Party. I've heard it said that Mr. Trump isn't the disease, he's only a symptom. I would say that just a little differently. He's not the disease, he's a complication. He picked up, apparently some of this stuff he actually believes, but he picked up on these undercurrents and gave them voice and rode them to power. The other thing is, Republicans have tended all my life to believe that we can't lose an honest election. I think that that's unrealistic. Democrats mutter stuff like that too. They don't storm the Capitol building over it. But this is not new with Mr. Trump. It's been bubbling. Labor, blue-collar people, union members did not like the developing situation, and I might add, quite apart from simply general distrust of foreigners, I think there's a certain amount of anti-yellow in this. First off, with some reason, it was against the Japanese. They attacked us, we beat them, and they're beating, and then to China. So I am not sure where that insight goes. I would say one thing before I go. Personally, I'm very grateful to Canada for its efforts to take in the Vietnamese refugees. Very few Yanks realize how many more Canadians served in American uniforms than Americans defected to Canada. I would say that for another time Canada had a Cinderella army, this time in American uniforms, but God bless them.
That's an excellent thought to end on, and I really appreciate the input. We are in America's heartland, and this is the home not only of Donald Trump, but also, very importantly, J.D. Vance. And so these issues and how they percolate with blue-collar workers and others around the country are important. We don't want to dismiss the concern, while at the same time we talk about the symptoms and the challenges we face. With that, I think we can adjourn for lunch. I'll turn it over to Steve.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks to your panel. Outstanding. We're going to take a break now for lunch. It should be brought in, and then we will begin our luncheon program with our keynote speaker.